In 1943, a routine aerial survey flying over a remote sector of the Amazon basin recorded a stark anomaly. Embedded deep within the uniform expanse of the canopy was a rigid, geometric structure. This was a crude, man-made platform suspended nearly 100 feet above the jungle floor. It sat squarely in the apex predator zone, entirely detached from the ground below. The occupant of this platform was Daniel Foster, a British traveler presumed dead for years. He had existed entirely within the branches of this single tree for 2,190 days. He had not touched the earth a single time. Prolonged survival in a hyper-dense biome demands total biological and psychological assimilation into the surrounding environment. To understand how a human organism endures 6 years of vertical isolation, we have to analyze 3 distinct phases: the initial analog incursion and trapping, the mechanics of arboreal survival, and the final psychological extraction. Extreme environments do not tolerate resistance. They mandate complete transformation of the human system. The parameters of Foster's journey were established in September 1937. He and 2 companions, Mark and Ethan, planned a strictly scheduled 4-day excursion to the edge of the Amazon. They viewed it as a simple tourist venture. Reaching the Amazon prior to widespread commercial aviation required crossing 8,000 kilometers of the Atlantic. The physical distance from any modern infrastructure was vast before they even reached the continent. After arriving in South America, their approach transitioned entirely to local, unmapped infrastructure. They relied on trains, buses, and finally wooden riverboats to reach the exact point where civilization stopped and the canopy began. Their 1930s loadout reflected their casual intent. They carried heavy canvas backpacks, thick coats, a single pocket knife, and hand-cranked flashlights. They had no radio telemetry, no GPS, and 0 specialized survival tools. Their caloric supply was even more precarious. They packed dry bread and sugar. This is a dietary loadout designed exclusively for a short, highly scheduled walk where immediate return is guaranteed. They walked into one of the highest density biomes on Earth, completely blind to the operational safety nets required to survive it. Once they stepped off the riverbank, the dense, repeating fractal geometry of the Amazon canopy immediately disrupted their spatial awareness. Every direction looked identical. This diagram illustrates their navigational error. Stepping away from the riverbank to avoid mud, they lost their acoustic baseline. The sound of moving water was absorbed by vegetation. Attempting a standard 10-minute correction to find their way back without this anchor resulted in total spatial loss. Search and rescue operations face a logistical wall in the Amazon. Without a localized itinerary, the search area becomes effectively infinite, with the dense canopy absorbing all visual signatures from the air. Nightfall presented an immediate biological threat. The flooded terrain and the presence of nocturnal ground predators forced them to make a rapid tactical decision. Foster chose to ascend a large tree. At that moment, it was a logical, short-term defensive maneuver designed simply to survive the night above the predator line. The next morning, Foster descended slightly to look for his companions, only to find they had scattered and vanished. His temporary defensive elevation instantly locked him into a permanent geographic trap. Remaining in the canopy created an immediate biological crisis. With groundwater completely inaccessible, Foster's survival depended on exploiting the specific microclimate of the branches around him. Observe his passive hydration model in this diagram. Foster utilized broad tropical leaves to capture morning dew. This water channeled drop by drop into his canteen, a painstakingly slow process, barely keeping his cells operating. Once his dry rations were depleted within the first few days, his body entered severe starvation mode. His caloric deficit became the next critical threat. To survive, his physiology had to adapt to the sparse food supply. Rapid weight loss and severe muscle atrophy lowered his base metabolic rate, drastically reducing the calories his body demanded to stay alive. This wireframe demonstrates how he engineered a shelter using his hands and a pocket knife. Interlocking branches between 2 thick boughs created a tension-based grid. Layering massive, broad leaves over this friction grid, like shingles, produced a waterproof barrier against tropical storms. The shelter was a biological sustainment pod, a friction-based barrier that kept his deteriorating system barely viable while suspended in the air. In the early weeks, Foster actively shouted for his friends. Over time, he initiated a strict silence protocol, ceasing all vocalization completely. This silence served a dual purpose. It prevented him from attracting the attention of apex predators, and it conserved the vital caloric energy required to project sound through the dense foliage. Stripped of societal anchors, Foster lost all temporal tracking. The constant cycle of equatorial rain and sun caused time to blur into a continuous state. His mind gradually reclassified the shelter. It was no longer a temporary waiting room for rescue. It became his permanent, accepted reality. He abandoned the concept of rescue entirely. This resulted in a total mental surrender, choosing passive, sustained existence over the active, panic-driven mechanics of survival. Enduring pure isolation for thousands of days demands the complete dissolution of the ego into the surrounding environment. The resolution arrived by sheer chance in 1943. An aerial research team began surveying Foster's sector of the Amazon. From their altitude, spotting a single human figure in the dense canopy is nearly mathematically impossible. This visual overlay highlights the mechanics of aerial identification. While the human body is easily camouflaged, the rigid, angular geometry of Foster's shelter stood out in sharp contrast to the fractal, circular patterns of the natural vegetation. Once spotted, the extraction presented a severe logistical challenge. The crew had to hoist a critically malnourished, psychologically altered subject into an early model aircraft without inducing a fatal stress response. When the helicopter landed and Foster was unloaded, he experienced massive biological shock. It was the first time his feet had touched solid ground in exactly 6 years. His reintegration into England revealed the extent of his physical degradation. His muscles were heavily atrophied, his hair reached past his shoulders, and his facial structure was sunken from years of caloric deficit. The psychological vacancy was profound. When he finally stood before his parents at their front door, they looked at his face and failed to recognize their own son. Foster's survival demonstrates the extreme adaptability of human biology under vertical isolation, though the cost of that endurance was a transformation so complete his own family